Hey everyone, and welcome back. In this video, part of a longer series exploring key themes and issues in American government, we're going to look at the Articles of Confederation, their breakdown, and the ways in which that breakdown led to the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. There's a lot to consider, so let's get to it. Most Americans are familiar, at least in broad terms, with the drafting of the U.S. Constitution. The story usually focuses on the Constitutional Convention of the summer of 1787, where James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and the other representatives of the various states met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to draft the U.S. Constitution. We explore this process and the various debates and compromises that took place there in another video. But what's sometimes overlooked is the fact that this was not the first attempt at drafting the Constitution of these United States. Indeed, the Constitutional Convention took place in 1787, almost a decade after the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. So, how was the United States governed during the intervening decade? It was governed under the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. Negotiated at the Continental Congress in 1777 and ratified in 1781, the Articles provided the framework for the first government of the United States. Now, in thinking about the Articles of Confederation, it's important to bear in mind the historical period in which they were drafted and adopted. The colonies were engaged in the Revolutionary War, a struggle for independence from the British Crown. Indeed, the Revolutionary War began in 1775, 2 years before the Articles were drafted, and would not formally conclude until 1784, 3 years after the Articles were ratified. And we can clearly see the impact of the Revolutionary War experience on the Articles. The Revolution was justified rhetorically in terms of individual rights and liberties, most notably through the Declaration of Independence, and were thus at the center of the text of the Articles of Confederation. Further, the Articles emphasized state sovereignty and placed strict limits on the power of the central government, both a recognition of the political reality of the colonies at the time and a reaction to the centralized nature of the British political system. And so the type of government created under the Articles of Confederation reflected that historical period. Most notably, the type of government established under the Articles was a confederation, meaning that the ultimate authority or sovereignty rested with the governments of the individual states rather than with the national government. The national government had only those powers specifically granted to it by the states, and any decisions of that government had to be unanimously approved by the representatives of the states. Nevertheless, the 13 articles included in the document did outline the basic structure and function of a national government. Most importantly, Article 1 established the name of the Confederation as the United States of America, the reason the country has the unusual name it has today. Article 2 maintained the sovereignty of the individual states. Article 3 outlined the basic purpose of Confederation, namely to establish a firm league of friendship and to maintain their common defense. Article 4 provided for the equal treatment under the law and the free movement of the inhabitants between the states. Article 5 established the equal representation of the states in the legislature, formerly known as the United States in the Congress assembled, affording each state a single vote regardless of the number of representatives a state may have in Congress. Articles 6 through 9 limited the power of the central government to just declaring war, conducting foreign policy, and regulating post offices, leaving all other matters to the states. And even the exercise of many of these powers required the consent of the states. And finally, Article 12 affirmed that the Confederation would honor the debts owed by the Continental Congress accrued during the Revolutionary War, even while not granting it the power to raise taxes or borrow. In the simplest terms, all of that meant that the government established under the Articles of Confederation, a loose confederation of states with a weak central government, was not up to the task of addressing the central political and economic challenges of the day. The Congress lacked the power to levy taxes, regulate foreign or interstate commerce, or effectively negotiate with foreign powers. Meanwhile, the economic and political situation in the United States was rapidly deteriorating. The United States had acquired huge debts during the Revolutionary War, which now fell to the national government to repay. But that government lacked the ability to levy taxes and print currency. Most states suffered from rampant inflation and regional tensions between the settled eastern coast and the frontier, as well as tensions between large states and small states, and between northern and southern states, made finding compromise increasingly difficult. Two specific crises illustrate the scope of the challenges and the inability of the national government to address them, ultimately sparking demand for a new system of government. The first of these was the Philadelphia Mutiny of June 1783. In short, the Philadelphia Mutiny took place when nearly 400 soldiers who had fought in the Revolutionary War stormed a meeting of the Congress demanding a national government make good on the significant amounts of back pay they were owed. The problem was that the national government lacked the funds to pay them. Instead, delegates to the Congress asked the government of the state of Pennsylvania to deploy their state militia to protect Congress. When the state of Pennsylvania declined to do so, the Congress suspended its meeting and reconvened in Princeton, New Jersey. A few days later, George Washington heard of the mutiny and, as commander of the Continental Army, sent some 1,500 soldiers to Pennsylvania to suppress the mutiny. For its part, Congress called for an investigation into the event. Nevertheless, the Philadelphia Mutiny highlighted the weakness of the central government and the dangers of political instability and unrest. In the eyes of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who was a delegate to the Congress when the mutiny occurred, it demonstrated the urgent need for a stronger central government with the power to regulate commerce, raise taxes, and provide for the national defense. The mutiny also helped to galvanize support for a new constitution, as it highlighted the dangers of political instability and the need for a stronger, more effective system of government. Finally, the experience of the mutiny was also a key reason for the designation of a national capital district that would ultimately become Washington, D.C. The second major crisis of the Confederation period was Shays' Rebellion, an anti-tax protest led by Daniel Shays, a farmer and Revolutionary War veteran in western Massachusetts in the late 1786 and early 1787. Shays' Rebellion was the culmination of years of unrest. The roots of the crisis lay in the economic conditions of the post-Revolutionary War environment that, in the eyes of the rural citizens of the western part of the state, favored the commercial interests in the cities over the rural interests of farmers. Farmers faced heavy debt burdens, and merchants concerned about repayment and inflation began cutting back on the historical practice of extending credit, instead requiring payment in hard currency. Further, the tax burdens imposed by the state of Massachusetts and other states to repay the Revolutionary War debt increasingly squeezed farmers' margins. The shortage of hard currency made it difficult for farmers to meet these obligations, leading many to lose their land. There was also an intense sense of political alienation and disenfranchisement among the citizens of the rural West, who believed the state government was dominated by coastal elites. They felt that the government was unresponsive to their needs and that they were being unfairly burdened by high taxes and regulations. And remember that many of these farmers, including Daniel Shays, their leader, were veterans of the Revolutionary War. Having just fought one tyrannical government over similar issues, they were not inclined to let another behave in similar ways. They began to engage in a variety of forms of direct political action intended to voice their dissatisfaction. As early as 1782, farmers in western Massachusetts were preventing tax collectors from doing their work and were seizing property that had been confiscated by local government officials and returning it to its owners. In August 1787, protesters in rural Massachusetts, including Daniel Shays, blocked the courts in Northampton from meeting. Similar protests took place across Massachusetts over the next couple of months, preventing the courts from hearing property claims. The protests sparked concerns among the coastal elite, with Samuel Adams decrying the protesters as foreign agents and calling for their public execution. In a letter to James Madison, then Speaker of the Massachusetts House, James Warren said, "We are now in a state of anarchy and confusion bordering on civil war." The legislature moved to quell the protests by offering some concessions, including permitting some taxes to be paid in goods rather than in hard currency, and offering amnesty to protesters willing to take an oath of allegiance. But it simultaneously imposed new, stricter measures prohibiting speech critical of the government and suspending habeas corpus. Not surprisingly, the new laws did little to quell the uprising, and Shays and his compatriots, some 1,500 rebels, marched on the Springfield Armory and attempted to seize the weapons located there. They were met by a privately funded army paid for by Massachusetts merchants and organized by the state governor. After the private military fired on the protesters with cannons, Shays' rebels fled and ultimately sought sanctuary in New Hampshire and Vermont. While Shays' Rebellion ultimately failed, it nevertheless had a significant impact on the push for a new U.S. Constitution. The The rebellion highlighted the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and the dangers of political instability and unrest. It also demonstrated the importance of a strong central government with the power to regulate commerce and provide for national defense. And perhaps most importantly, it gave impetus for calls for a new constitutional convention to address these weaknesses. That convention would take place just a few months after Shays' rebellion so clearly highlighted the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, ironically in the very same building that the Philadelphia Mutiny forced the Congress to flee in 1783. But that convention is the topic for another video. That's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching. Bye.